You think California is the land of dreams, the golden coast where fortunes are made and sunshine never ends. Let me take you back to a place that would kill you in 7 days. Forget everything you know about this state. Forget the beaches, the tech companies, the palm trees lining perfect streets. I'm talking about a California where the ground beneath your feet could swallow you whole, where a simple cut on your hand meant a death sentence, and where the very air you breathed carried diseases that turned your insides to liquid. You wouldn't make it. I know you think you would. You've watched the survival shows, you've gone camping, maybe you pride yourself on being tough. None of that matters. In early California, toughness didn't save you. Luck barely saved you. And most people, they didn't get saved at all. Imagine waking up in a canvas tent in 1849. There's no coffee waiting for you because coffee costs more than you'll make in a week of backbreaking labor. The man sleeping 3 feet from you has been coughing blood for 2 days, but there's nowhere else to sleep. Outside, someone is screaming. You don't investigate. You learned on day 2 not to investigate the screaming. You have dysentery. Everyone has dysentery. Your boots have holes, your hands are infected, and you haven't seen a vegetable in 6 weeks. It's Tuesday. Welcome to early California. The next 5,000 words will prove why you wouldn't survive it. This isn't exaggeration. This isn't dramatization. This is what life was actually like in the state that would become America's richest, built on the backs of people who died by the thousands just trying to make it through another week. Let's begin with the world that would break you. We're dropping you into California between 1848 and 1870, the era that transformed this remote frontier into a death trap disguised as opportunity. This isn't the California of Spanish missions and peaceful ranchos. That world ended the moment James Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill on January 24, 1848. Within months, word spread like wildfire. Within a year, 100,000 people flooded into California. They called themselves 49ers. History should have called them the desperate, the doomed, and the damned. Picture the landscape you're entering. If you came by ship, you survived Cape Horn, where waves the size of buildings capsized vessels regularly. If you came overland, you crossed 2,000 miles of desert, mountains, and plains that were already decorated with the graves of those who tried before you. The trails were marked not with signs, but with abandoned wagons, dead oxen, and wooden crosses. You arrive in California exhausted, broke, and probably sick. What greets you? Not the California you imagine. San Francisco in 1849 was a nightmare of mud, tents, and chaos. Streets didn't exist. Buildings were thrown together from canvas and scrap wood. The entire city was a fire waiting to happen, and it did, repeatedly, burning to the ground 6 times in 18 months. The weather wasn't your friend. Summers in the mining regions reached 110 degrees. Men died of heat stroke in the rivers they were panning. Winters brought flooding that wiped out entire camps overnight. The Sierra Nevada trapped people in snow so deep that some resorted to cannibalism. The Donner Party wasn't an isolated incident, just the most famous one. But it wasn't just the gold rush regions that would kill you. Los Angeles was a dusty pueblo of about 1,600 people, known as one of the most violent towns in America. 1 in every 75 residents was murdered. Those are war zone statistics. The Central Valley was a swamp infested with mosquitoes carrying malaria. The northern forests were so remote that if you got injured, you simply died where you fell because no help was coming. The coastline, beautiful as it looked, offered dangerous currents and shark-infested waters. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there were no hospitals, no police protection, no safety regulations, no workers' rights, and no one to save you when things went wrong. California had become a state in 1850, but statehood on paper meant nothing when you were dying of cholera in a mining camp 3 weeks' journey from any real settlement. The land itself was hostile. Rattlesnakes hid in every rock pile. Mountain lions stalked the forests. Grizzly bears, massive California grizzlies that could weigh 1,500 pounds, roamed freely and attacked without warning. One miner described watching a grizzly tear a man's scalp off in a single swipe. This was your new home. This was the California dream. Now let's talk about what your daily life looked like. Let's start with where you sleep because even rest is dangerous here. If you're lucky, you have a canvas tent. If you're not, you sleep under a tree or in a hole you dug in the hillside. Your tent leaks when it rains, and it rains hard in California winters. Everything you own gets soaked. There's no way to dry it. You sleep in wet clothes, on wet ground, breathing wet air. The tent offers no privacy and no protection. You share it with strangers who might rob you, who definitely have lice, and who cough tuberculosis bacteria into the air you're breathing all night. There's no lock on a tent. While you sleep, rats the size of cats crawl over you looking for food scraps. Morning comes early because sleeping past dawn means losing work time, and losing work time means starving. There's no bathroom. You walk into the woods and hope you don't squat near poison oak or on a rattlesnake. Toilet paper doesn't exist for you. You use leaves if you're lucky. More often, you use your hand and rinse it in whatever water is available. Water. Let's talk about water because it's killing you slowly. Every water source in the mining regions is contaminated. Thousands of men are panning, digging, defecating, and dying in these rivers. Upstream from you, someone has dysentery and is using the river as their toilet. Downstream, you're filling your canteen from the same water. You'll have dysentery by tomorrow. There's no way to purify water effectively. Boiling it helps, but fuel is scarce and expensive. Most people just drink it straight from the river and pray. Prayer doesn't stop waterborne diseases. Food is a nightmare. Forget balanced meals. Forget nutrition. You're eating salt pork, hardtack crackers that are often infested with weevils and beans. The same thing every single day. Scurvy is epidemic because fresh fruits and vegetables are impossibly expensive or simply don't exist in mining camps. Your gums bleed when you eat. Your teeth are loosening. Old wounds reopen spontaneously. That's scurvy destroying you from the inside. If you want fresh meat, you have to hunt it or buy it at prices that would make you weep. A single egg could cost $3. That's about $100 in today's money. An apple, $5. Most miners went months without tasting fresh food. Cooking happens over an open fire, assuming you have the energy to build one after working all day. Your pot is probably the same one everyone in camp uses. It hasn't been properly cleaned in weeks. Food poisoning is just another Tuesday. Personal hygiene is a joke. You don't bathe. There's nowhere to bathe. Maybe once a month you jump in a freezing river and call yourself clean. Your clothes rot on your body because you wear them every day for months without washing. The smell of a mining camp was indescribable. Thousands of unwashed men, open latrines, animal carcasses, and the sulfur smell of mining operations. Your hair is full of lice. Everyone's hair is full of lice. You accept it the way you accept hunger and pain as just another part of being alive. You scratch until you bleed, then the scratches get infected, and now you have sores on your scalp that attract flies. Speaking of infections, every minor injury becomes life-threatening. You scrape your arm on a rock while panning for gold. By the next day, the scratch is red and hot. By day 3, red streaks are running up your arm. By day 5, you're delirious with fever. By day 7, you're dead from sepsis. This scenario played out thousands of times. There are no antibiotics. There's barely any medical care. A wound gets infected, and you either survive or you don't, depending on luck and the strength of your immune system. Most people's immune systems were already weakened by malnutrition, exhaustion, and constant exposure to disease. The weather is trying to kill you too. In summer, you work in heat that makes you dizzy. There's no shade in most mining areas. The hillsides are stripped bare. Men collapsed regularly from heat stroke. In winter, you're wet and cold all the time. Hypothermia killed people who thought they were just a bit chilly. Frostbite took fingers and toes from miners who worked in freezing rivers. And at night, when you finally collapse from exhaustion, you lie in your damp tent listening to the sounds of the camp, coughing, crying, arguing, sometimes screaming. You try not to think about the fact that you've been here 6 days and you haven't found any gold. You try not to think about home. You try not to think about the fact that you're probably going to die here in this miserable place thousands of miles from anyone who loves you. This is daily life. This is just existing. We haven't even gotten to the work yet. You came here to get rich. You heard the stories, men finding nuggets the size of eggs, streams lined with gold dust, instant fortunes waiting to be claimed. Every single one of those stories was true. They were also statistically irrelevant. For every man who struck it rich, 1,000 went broke. For every success story that made it into newspapers, 10,000 men died poor, broken, and forgotten. You're going to be one of the 10,000. Your work begins before sunrise. You grab your pan, your pickaxe, and you head to whatever claim you've staked or whatever riverbank you're allowed to work. If you're panning, you spend 12 to 16 hours bent over a river, scooping gravel and water, swirling it, searching for the glint of gold. Your back screams, your knees buckle, your hands go numb in the freezing water. Most days you find nothing. Some days you find a few flakes of gold dust worth maybe 50 cents. Occasionally you find enough to make $1 or $2. You need about $20 a week just to survive, to pay for food, tools, and whatever shelter you have. You do the math. You're not making it. Some men work in hard rock mines and their lives are even worse. You descend into tunnels that could collapse at any moment. There are no safety regulations, no inspections, no one checking whether the support beams are strong enough. Cave-ins are regular. When the rock falls, you're buried alive. Sometimes they dig you out. Usually they don't bother. The air in the mines is poison. You breathe rock dust, mercury vapor from gold processing, and whatever gases seep up from below. Black lung disease is your future if cave-ins don't kill you first. Men in their 30s cough like they're 90. If you work for someone else, in a mine, on a farm, building a railroad, you're paid almost nothing and treated as disposable. Chinese immigrants building the Central Pacific Railroad were given the most dangerous jobs, handling explosives, working on cliff faces, tunneling through mountains. They died by the hundreds. The railroad company literally calculated that it was cheaper to let workers die and hire replacements than to implement safety measures. Wages were a cruel joke. Common laborers might make $2-3 per day, but everything cost 10 times what it did back east. That $3 bought you basic food and nothing else. Forget saving money. Forget sending money home to your family. You were trapped in a cycle of work and poverty that ground you down to dust. And then there were the accidents. You slip while carrying a pickaxe and it goes through your foot. You're done. You can't work with a ruined foot and there's no workers' compensation, no disability, no safety net of any kind. You either heal or you become a beggar. Most became beggars. Explosives were used constantly in mining, and men who had no training were handling them. Premature detonations blew bodies apart. Misfires left men blind or missing hands. You learned to recognize the miners who'd been there a while by counting their fingers. The companies and claim owners held all the power. They set the rules, the wages, the conditions. If you complained, you were replaced within an hour. There was always someone more desperate than you willing to take your place. Crime in the workplace was rampant. Foremen stole from workers. Workers stole from each other. If you found gold, you told no one because someone would kill you for it. Men worked with weapons within reach because they trusted no one. Some turned to other work. Gambling, prostitution, selling liquor. These were often more profitable than honest labor and barely more dangerous. Women who came to California often found that running a boarding house or cooking meals for miners was the only way to survive, working 18-hour days for enough money to eat. Children worked too. Boys as young as 10 were in the mines, doing the jobs that adults found too dangerous or difficult. Nobody protected them. Nobody educated them. They worked or they starved, and many did both. The lumber industry was a death machine. Loggers felled massive redwoods using hand saws and axes. When a tree fell the wrong way, it crushed whoever was in its path. Sawmill accidents severed limbs regularly. You worked with exhaustion clouding your judgment, and exhaustion killed. Farming was backbreaking labor for marginal returns. You cleared land full of rocks and stumps, planted crops that might fail due to drought or flood, and harvested by hand in brutal heat. Many farmers went bankrupt and ended up in the mines, desperate for any chance at money. You're working yourself to death for poverty. The California dream is crushing you under its boot, and your body is breaking down faster than you realize. Let's talk about what's actually going to kill you, because in early California, the list of ways to die was impressively long. Start with cholera. It arrived in California with the gold seekers and spread like wildfire through the overcrowded, unsanitary camps. Cholera kills fast and ugly. You feel fine in the morning. By afternoon, you're vomiting and experiencing diarrhea so severe it empties your body of fluids. By evening, you're in agony as your muscles cramp from dehydration. By the next morning, you're dead. Cholera could kill you in less than 24 hours. Thousands died this way. They were buried in mass graves or shallow holes, often with dozens of bodies at a time. In San Francisco during the 1850 cholera outbreak, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The smell of death hung over the city for weeks. Then there's typhoid fever, spread through the same contaminated water you're drinking every day. Typhoid is a slower death than cholera, but just as certain. For weeks, you burn with fever. You develop rose-colored spots on your chest. You become delirious, sometimes violent. Your intestines might perforate, and then you die in absolute agony as your abdominal cavity fills with infection. Dysentery was so common that men considered it normal. Blood in your stool. Join the club. Crippling stomach cramps. Everyone has them. Dehydration slowly killing you. Welcome to California. Some forms of dysentery were relatively mild. Others, like amoebic dysentery, bored holes through your intestinal walls and created abscesses in your liver. Malaria ravaged the Central Valley. The Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys were breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and they carried malaria parasites that infected thousands. Malaria gives you cycles of fever and chills so intense you think you're dying. Many people did die. Others survived but were weakened for life, suffering recurring bouts of fever that left them unable to work. Tuberculosis, called consumption, was everywhere. It spread easily in crowded conditions, passed through the air every time someone coughed. TB is a slow death. Over months or years, it destroys your lungs. You cough constantly, bringing up blood. You lose weight until you're skeletal. You suffocate gradually as your lungs fill with fluid and decay. There was no cure. If you got TB, you died. Scurvy we mentioned, but understand how horrible it really was. Your gums don't just bleed, they rot away, exposing your teeth until they fall out. Old wounds reopen because your body can't maintain the healed tissue. You develop massive bruises from the slightest touch because your blood vessels are breaking down. You become weak, depressed, and eventually you die from internal bleeding or infection. All because you couldn't get vitamin C. Then there were the accidents. Mining accidents crushed, buried, drowned, and dismembered men daily. Logging accidents dropped tons of wood on workers. Construction accidents killed people building the very cities that would eventually house millions. Medical care was somewhere between useless and actively harmful. Doctors were scarce, and many weren't properly trained. They didn't understand germ theory because it hadn't been discovered yet. They operated with dirty instruments, never washing between patients, spreading infection from one person to the next. If you needed surgery, you got whiskey for anesthesia if you were lucky, a bullet to bite on if you were. The surgeon cut into you with tools that weren't sterile. Most surgical patients died of infection within days. Amputation was common for any serious limb injury, and most amputees died from the shock or from infection afterward. Medicine was primitive. Mercury was used to treat syphilis and other diseases, and the mercury poisoning often killed patients faster than the original disease. Opium was handed out liberally for pain, creating thousands of addicts. Bloodletting, literally cutting you open to drain your blood, was still practiced by some doctors, weakening already sick patients. Childbirth killed women constantly. Without modern medical care, complications that would be minor today became death sentences. Women died from hemorrhaging, infection, eclampsia, and obstructed labor. Their babies often died with them. The maternal mortality rate was nightmarish. Mental illness got no treatment at all. Men broke under the stress, loneliness, and trauma of frontier life. Some became violent, some catatonic, some wandered off into the wilderness and were never seen again. There were no mental hospitals, no therapy, no medication. You either held yourself together or you didn't. And then there was simple bad luck. A snake bite could kill you. A spider bite could kill you. An infected tooth could kill you. A fall from a horse could kill you. A bar fight could kill you. Everything could kill you and often did. Death was so common that people became numb to it. Bodies were found regularly in rivers, on trails, in tents. Sometimes they were buried. Sometimes they weren't. Cemeteries filled quickly and new ones had to be established. In some mining camps, the cemetery was the largest part of town. You lived with the constant knowledge that you might not survive another week. That knowledge hung over everything, making people reckless, desperate, and sometimes cruel. California in the gold rush era was one of the most violent places in American history. Law enforcement barely existed, and what did exist was often corrupt or overwhelmed. This created an environment where violence became the primary solution to problems. San Francisco had virtually no police force in 1849. The city was run by criminals, gangs, and whoever had enough guns to enforce their will. The Sydney Ducks, a gang of Australian convicts, controlled entire neighborhoods. They robbed, murdered, and set fires to create chaos they could exploit. When buildings burned, they looted them. In the mining camps, there was no law at all. Disputes over claims were settled with fists, knives, or guns. Murder was shockingly common and rarely punished. A man would kill someone over a disagreement about a claim boundary, and nothing would happen to him because there was no sheriff, no jail, no court system. When communities tried to establish justice, they created vigilante committees. These weren't noble groups of concerned citizens. They were lynch mobs given official-sounding names. Vigilante justice meant trial by angry crowd, followed by hanging from the nearest tree. Sometimes they got the right person. Often they didn't. Racism fueled much of the violence. Chinese immigrants were targeted constantly. They were robbed, beaten, murdered, and driven from their claims by white miners who didn't want competition. The foreign miners' tax, passed in 1850, charged non-citizens $20 a month for the privilege of mining, a sum most couldn't pay. When they couldn't pay, they were attacked. Mexican and South American miners faced similar persecution. Many had been in California long before the gold rush, but they were treated as foreigners and driven out violently. Native Americans had it worst of all. They were hunted for sport, poisoned, enslaved, and massacred. The California government paid bounties for Native American scalps. This was genocide, plain and simple. Women faced constant danger. Sexual assault was epidemic and almost never prosecuted. Women couldn't walk alone safely. Those who worked as prostitutes, many forced into it by poverty, faced violence from customers, pimps, and society at large. They had no legal protection whatsoever. Gambling halls and saloons were centers of violence. Men drank cheap, poisonous liquor that made them aggressive. They gambled away money they couldn't afford to lose, then turned violent when they lost. Shootings in saloons were nightly occurrences in some towns. Bodies would be dragged outside and left in the street until morning. Claim jumping was constant. You'd de-work a claim for weeks, then come back one morning to find armed men occupying it, daring you to try to reclaim it. If you fought back, you'd be killed. If you complained to authorities, they'd shrug. Possession was the only law that mattered. Road agents, highwaymen, made travel incredibly dangerous. Stagecoaches carrying gold were robbed regularly. Travelers were murdered for whatever they carried. Some roads became so dangerous that people traveled in large armed groups for protection, and even that didn't always work. Organized crime thrived. Gangs controlled prostitution, gambling, and extortion rackets. They bribed officials, killed competitors, and operated with impunity. San Francisco's Barbary Coast District was a nightmare of crime where you could be drugged, robbed, and shanghaied, kidnapped and forced to work on a ship. Dueling was common among those who considered themselves gentlemen. Men killed each other over insults, real or imagined, informal duels that everyone treated as perfectly normal. More often, people just shot each other in the street and walked away. There was no forensic science, no criminal investigation as we know it. If you murdered someone and weren't caught in the act, you'd probably get away with it. Bodies were buried and life went on. Nobody had the resources or inclination to investigate most crimes. Prisons barely existed, and jails were often just holes in the ground or wooden boxes. Escape was easy. Sentences were arbitrary. Sometimes vigilantes would break into jails and hang prisoners before they could be tried. You lived in constant fear. You couldn't trust neighbors, coworkers, or strangers. Everyone was armed. Arguments escalated to lethal violence in seconds. You learned to avoid eye contact, to walk away from confrontations, to never show weakness or wealth. Even then, you might not survive. Let's talk about the people who had it even worse than the average desperate miner. In early California, if you weren't a white American man, your life was exponentially harder and more dangerous. Women were scarce in early California. They made up less than 10% of the population in mining regions. This made them both valuable and vulnerable. Those who came with husbands worked themselves to exhaustion cooking, cleaning, and washing clothes for paying customers, while also maintaining their own households. A woman might wash mining clothes for 12 hours after doing all her own domestic labor. The work destroyed their hands and backs. Single women had almost no respectable options for survival. Many became prostitutes because there was literally no other way to make money. They were trapped in brothels controlled by madams or pimps, serving dozens of men per day. They faced disease, pregnancy without medical care, violence from customers, and universal social condemnation. Many committed suicide. Their average life expectancy after entering prostitution was about 4 years. Women had no legal rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property in most cases, couldn't testify in court in many situations. If a woman was assaulted, the legal system offered her no real recourse. Society blamed her for whatever happened to her. Pregnancy in early California was terrifying. Women gave birth in canvas tents, dirty cabins, or wherever they happened to be when labor started. Many died in childbirth along with their babies. Those who survived often had to return to backbreaking work within days because their families needed the income. Children in California suffered tremendously. Boys were put to work as soon as they were physically able, often by age 8 or 10. They worked in mines, on farms, in shops, doing adult labor for no pay or minimal wages. Accidents killed and maimed child workers regularly. Girls were married off young, often by age 14 or 15, to men who needed domestic labor disguised as wives. They went from childhood to motherhood with no transition, trapped in marriages they couldn't escape. Orphans were common. Parents died at such high rates that children were left alone constantly. These orphans became street children, begging or stealing to survive. Some were taken in by families who worked them as unpaid servants. Others were exploited worse. Chinese immigrants faced systematic oppression and violence. About 25,000 Chinese men came to California during the gold rush. They were forced to work claims that white miners had already abandoned. When they succeeded in finding gold, they were attacked and driven off their claims. The foreign miners' tax specifically targeted them. Chinese workers were paid less than white workers for the same jobs. They were given the most dangerous railroad construction jobs. They lived in segregated areas, denied access to most public spaces. They couldn't testify against whites in court, meaning whites could rob or attack them with legal impunity. Chinese women in California were often trafficking victims, forced into prostitution or domestic servitude. They had no way to escape and no legal protection. Society viewed them as less than human. Mexican Californians, called Californios, had lived in California for generations before the gold rush. They owned vast ranchos and had established communities. The American takeover destroyed their world. Their land was stolen through legal manipulation, fraud, and violence. They went from landowners to laborers on land their families had owned for decades. Native Americans faced extermination. California's native population dropped from about 1,050,000 in 1848 to less than 30,000 by 1870. They were massacred by militias, poisoned, starved, and forced into slavery. The California government spent $1.5 million funding expeditions to kill Native Americans. Entire peoples were wiped out. Native children were kidnapped and sold as workers in a system that was slavery by another name. Native women were raped and killed. Their bodies were left where they fell, considered less important than animal carcasses. African Americans in California existed in a legal gray area. California entered the Union as a free state, but it passed laws restricting black people's rights. They couldn't testify in court against whites. They faced discrimination in employment and housing. Some were kidnapped and taken to slave states. Freedom in California was conditional and fragile. Immigrants from South America, Europe, and elsewhere came seeking opportunity and found prejudice instead. Language barriers left them vulnerable to fraud. Cultural differences made them targets. They formed ethnic enclaves for protection, but were still marginalized and exploited. Everyone who wasn't a white American man was treated as expendable. Their lives were worth less, their suffering ignored, their deaths barely noted. They built California while being denied any share in its prosperity. If we had to identify the absolute worst moment, the period when survival in California felt most impossible, it would be the winter of 1849-1850. This was when the brutal reality of California crashed into the gold-seeking dreams of 100,000 people simultaneously. The immigrants who arrived in late 1849 came with almost nothing after their journey. They arrived to find all the easy gold already claimed. Prices were insane. Supply ships hadn't brought enough food. Winter was coming. Then the rains arrived. Northern California's wet season turned mining camps into seas of mud. Tents collapsed under the weight of water. Rivers flooded, wiping out temporary settlements. Men waded through knee-deep mud that sucked their boots off. There was nowhere dry to sleep, no way to stay warm, no escape. Cholera hit at the same time. The combination of overcrowding, contaminated water, and weakened immune systems created a perfect epidemic. In Sacramento, people died so fast that bodies were stacked like cordwood waiting for burial. San Francisco lost hundreds. Mining camps were devastated. Scurvy became critical during winter because fresh food became even more scarce. Men's teeth fell out. They collapsed from weakness. They died from minor infections their bodies couldn't fight. Starvation set in. Food supplies ran out in remote camps. Prices for what remained were impossible. A man who'd spent his last dollar getting to California found himself choosing between eating and having shelter. Many chose neither, too weak to afford either. The death rate was astronomical. Estimates suggest that 20% of people who came to California in 1849 died within the first 2 years. That's 1 in 5. In some camps, it was higher. Entire groups were wiped out. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who'd left families behind realized they'd made a horrible mistake. They were trapped, too poor to leave, but too poor to survive staying. Letters from this period describe utter despair. Many wrote that they wished they'd never heard of California. Suicide spiked. Men walked into rivers with rocks in their pockets. They shot themselves in their tents. They simply disappeared into the wilderness to die alone. The despair was crushing, and there was no help, no counseling, no support system. Some went insane. The isolation, hardship, disappointment, and constant death broke their minds. They wandered camps ranting, sometimes violent, sometimes catatonic. Their fellow miners ignored them because everyone was struggling too hard to help anyone else. Violence escalated as desperation grew. Men killed each other over scraps of food, over shelter, over perceived slights. The thin veneer of civilization disappeared entirely. It became survival of the most ruthless. This was the reality of California's darkest hour. Thousands of people trapped in a muddy, disease-ridden hellscape, watching each other die while clinging to a dream that was already dead. The California dream had become the California nightmare, and there was no waking up. Look around you right now. You're safe, clean, and comfortable in ways that would seem like magic to someone from 1849. You're thirsty. You walk to a tap and pour yourself clean water that won't kill you. In early California, every drink of water was a gamble with cholera or dysentery. The fact that you can trust your water supply represents hundreds of thousands of lives saved. You're hungry. You have access to fresh fruits and vegetables year-round. You can afford them. You won't develop scurvy. You won't lose your teeth. That orange you might grab without thinking would have cost a 49 a week's wages and might have saved his life. You get a cut or a scrape. You clean it with soap, maybe put on a bandage. It heals without incident. In early California, that same cut could become an infection that killed you in a week. Antibiotics, which you can get with a quick doctor's visit or even over the counter for minor infections, would have seemed like miracles. You work 40 hours a week, maybe more, and you think it's hard. Miners worked 16-hour days in conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation. You have weekends. They didn't. You have workers' compensation if you're injured. They had nothing. You can quit a bad job. They were often trapped by debt or circumstance. You sleep in a bed, in a room with walls and a roof that doesn't leak. You're warm in winter and cool in summer. You have privacy. You're not sleeping 3 feet from a stranger with tuberculosis. You can't imagine what it meant to them to have what you take completely for granted. Modern California has more wealth than most countries. Early California had people dying of poverty and starvation while standing on gold deposits. Today's homeless crisis is tragic, but even in homelessness, people have access to food banks, shelters, emergency medical care, resources that didn't exist at all in 1849. You won't die of cholera, typhoid, or dysentery. These diseases have been essentially eliminated in the developed world. You're vaccinated against diseases that killed thousands in early California. If you get seriously ill, you go to a hospital with trained doctors, sterile equipment, and medicine that actually works. Women can vote, own property, work any job, leave bad marriages, and have legal protection against assault. Children go to school instead of mines. They have childhoods. Immigrants have legal protections, paths to citizenship, and civil rights. None of this existed in early California. The violence is gone. You can walk down a street without being armed. You can have a disagreement without expecting it to turn lethal. There are police, courts, and a justice system that, while imperfect, actually functions. In early California, there was only violence and revenge. California today is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's built on innovation, agriculture, entertainment, and technology. It was built on the bones of people who suffered unimaginably to survive here. Every comfort you enjoy exists because people after them decided that no one should have to live and die the way the 49ers did. You wouldn't have survived early California. That's not an insult. It's just truth. Most people didn't survive it. The ones who did were scarred physically and psychologically in ways we can barely imagine. The California you know, the beaches, the cities, the opportunities, was purchased with tremendous suffering. Thousands died building the foundation of the state. Thousands more were broken, displaced, or destroyed in the process. The glamorous California narrative erases these people, but they were real. When you think about the good old days, remember that for most of human history, the days were brutal, short, and filled with suffering that would seem impossible to endure. Modern life isn't perfect, but it's a paradise compared to what your ancestors lived through. Early California proves something important. Progress is real. The improvements in public health, workers' rights, civil rights, and basic quality of life represent genuine achievements. People fought, advocated, and sacrificed to create a world where you don't have to worry about dying from a cut or drinking water. Be grateful. Not in a shallow way, but deeply grateful that you live now, in a time when survival doesn't require daily miracles. You have access to medicine, clean water, safety, and rights that people in early California couldn't even dream about. And remember the people who didn't make it. The miners who died alone in their tents, the women who died in childbirth, the children who worked until they dropped, the immigrants who faced violence and persecution, the Native Americans who were nearly exterminated. Their suffering built the foundation you stand on. If you found this documentary eye-opening, there are dozens more exploring the harsh realities of early American states. Each one reveals just how difficult survival was in different regions and time periods. Each one will make you grateful for the present. Thank you for watching. Share this with someone who romanticizes the past. They need to understand what it actually meant to live in early America. And remember, you wouldn't survive 1 week in early California. Be glad you don't have to try.